Next, we're going to continue our consideration of America's founding values and how they're supported or challenged in the present age. America was formed in the crucible of religious turmoil. Has it ever not been so? With a continuing struggle, freedom of religion, freedom from religion. So today we're going to talk about religion. Please welcome back Ed Edelson.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you all for coming out to continue this conversation about the founding principles. And I think given that we are in a presidential election, there's no better time than to re-examine our founding principles and where we're going. When Christine and I lived in South Florida back in the 1990s, we would often hear news about a prominent minister from one of the mainline churches known as the Coral. It must have been the church bells. Prominent minister from the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church named James Kennedy. He was a vocal critic of Thomas Jefferson, the founding father. Jefferson, as the Reverend Kennedy saw it, got it wrong when thinking about the founding principles, especially about the important role of religion. Reverend Kennedy bemoaned the fact that the Constitution does not mention God even once. This was an error in his mind, as everyone knows that, quote, the U.S. is a Christian nation founded on Christian principles. To us, it sounded counter to everything we had learned about the founding principle of religious liberty. Back then, it was a fringe idea. Now, although it is true that the Constitution does not use the word God, the Declaration of Independence does. That's why I wrote it out here for all of you. So, Reverend Kennedy, we use this fact to show how the initial, and some might say the most important document that lays out the principles upon which this country was founded, does mention God. So why wasn't Reverend Kennedy satisfied with that? One reason might be the phrase in the Declaration of Independence regarding what one people can do. And it says that we can, quote, assume the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and to nature's God entitle them. But what should we make from this turn of phrase, nature's God? It seems strange to me when I read it to think that religious language would usually refer to God creating nature. That's God's nature, and not nature possessing God, as in nature's God. So why did they use that term in the Declaration? In one of my favorite interviews on Fresh Air, the radio show, back in the 1980s, the famous public scientist Carl Sagan was asked if he believed in God. Sagan responded to host Terry Gross by saying, quote, if you will define God, I will answer the question. Terry Gross did not take up the challenge. I believe that with this phrase, nature's God, the founders were laying down some qualifications, if not a definition, for the term God. It is not what Reverend Kennedy would appreciate. This was an era when God was deemed to be, by the vast majority, to have been at the cause of everything that happened. That conventional wisdom was being challenged at that time, both in Europe and in the colonies. The founders were all heavily influenced by what we now call the Enlightenment, which stressed the use of reason, science, and freedom of thought from dogma and superstition. So my reading of nature's God is that it reflects the founders' conviction that there was actually a rational basis for how the natural world works. And although much was known about this world, there was much that was yet to be discovered and understood. But there was no need for a supernatural force. In fact, as many of you might know, Jefferson took time while he was president to create his own version of the New Testament, but without any miracles. Jefferson's Bible, as it's called, was for many years given to each new senator when they took their original oath upon becoming a senator from 1904 until the 1950s. Thomas Jefferson's concern about religious liberty were already well formed when he was asked to write the Declaration of Independence, and included that phrase, nature's God. My reading is that in modern language, we would just call it science. For it is scientific principles that explain how nature works. The words in the Declaration could be read as, quote, the laws of nature as determined by science. Jefferson advocated for a wall of separation between church and state in his writings that are called Notes on the State of Virginia, which was enshrined in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That statute is one of the three most cherished achievements of Thomas Jefferson. So those who hang on the presence of the word God in the Declaration of Independence as a basis for saying this was a country founded as a Christian nation are on shaky ground at best. Now, when the U.S. Constitution was being ratified, people like Jefferson were concerned that the focus was all on bureaucratic process and structure. Constraints on what the government could or could not do was not made clear. And that was especially true about religious freedom. And that is the reason for the First Amendment, which states, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This amendment is typically described as having two parts, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Together they work to create an environment of religious liberty. This, I think, is what really bothered Reverend Kennedy. I can't imagine a clearer statement that the government of the United States should not become a theocracy like so many countries in Europe at that time. The founders were very well aware of the vicious, deadly wars in Europe between Catholic and Protestant nations, as well as between Catholic and Protestants within a nation. They were as brutal as we have seen between Shiite and Sunni Muslims in the 20th and 21st century. In addition, they did not want a nation to be guided by a particular religion. For me, the First Amendment is a clear calling for the government not to be aligned with any particular religion, let alone be guided by any one religious doctrine or constraining individuals to their right of conscience on religious questions and rituals. Now, some have noted that this does not say what an established religion can do or impose as conditions on the government or its representatives, if you are going the other way. They would say that it does not restrict a citizen from using their religious beliefs to affect their influence on government, whether as a citizen or as an elected official. Let me say this makes no logical sense to me. If we have elected or appointed officials applying their own religious doctrines or beliefs to override what the government they are part of is doing or refusing to do, then a specific religious set of values is being established. So that is why when I heard Reverend Kennedy preaching about the United States being a Christian nation formed on Christian principles, I was amazed that he could believe that this was true or historically accurate. However, I would argue that the views expressed by Kennedy decades ago now form the basis of the rulings about religious liberty under our Supreme Court. In the interest of time, I will not go through some of the recent rulings, but I would note the latest effort, and the fact that this is even coming forward shows how far the court has made. And that's the effort to have the Ten Commandments posted in public buildings in Louisiana. I believe that those who initiated this believe that they will actually get a favorable ruling from the current Supreme Court, even though many prior rulings by the Supreme Court have said this is not constitutional. But they believe this time it's going to be found constitutional because of the chipping away at what was a founding principle. But what would following the Ten Commandments mean for a public official, either elected or appointed? The fourth commandment says, you shall keep the Sabbath day holy. Would it be appropriate to arrest all business owners who are open on the Sabbath? By the way, is that Sunday, or is it Saturday, or is it Thursday? Or how about you shall not commit adultery? Should we amend the Constitution to clarify that no one can run for office who has committed adultery? Well, you may say that sounds a bit far-fetched or that I'm exaggerating. I may have agreed with you a decade ago, But let's look at the 2025 mandate for leadership by the Heritage Foundation, also known as Project 2025. In a section called Sabbath Rest, the mandate says, quote, God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor the mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. Moreover, a shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together rather as autonomized individuals and provides a healthier cadence of life for everyone. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism and secularism, especially for low-income workers. Therefore, Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. Now, you may agree with the idea of Sabbath in general, and I think I do, but the U.S. government has never felt it necessary to impose this. And as I mentioned, there is no common agreement across religions on which day is the Sabbath. And if you're not a member of a religious organization, will you still get time and a half? Here's another section that makes it explicit about religiously based decisions regarding employment are superior to non-discrimination laws. They say in the mandate, Congress should clarify Title VII's religious organization exemptions to make it more explicit that those employers may make employment decisions based on religion regardless of non-discrimination laws. There are many more examples in the report. In a review of Project 25, Rachel Laser, the president of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, described it as a 900-page playbook for restructuring the federal government in order to accomplish the policy goal of Christian nationalists. Quote, rolling back the rights of LGBTQ plus people, ending marriage equality, and even restricting divorce options, banning abortion, and limiting reproductive health care, throwing up roadblocks to racial justice, eliminating the Department of Education, and diverting public funds to private religious schools, and redefining religious freedom as a license to discriminate. Although I have not read all of the mandate, I think she is right, and I am convinced that the recent Supreme Court rulings, in conjunction with actions laid out in Project 2025, are a direct contradiction to the founding principles and especially the First Amendment. In a page out of George Orwell's book 1984, the supporters of the Supreme Court and Project 25 will say they are promoting these ideas in the name of religious freedom and liberty. In 1984, in the book, the Ministry of Truth promoted, quote, war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. I think if Orwell were alive today, he would add, a state religion is a free religion. Thank you for listening.